My name is Professor Fred Suppe. I'm a medieval historian and a Celticist here at Ball State University. I'm chairing this session of 3 student papers on under the heading of Early Europe's Political and Religious History. What we'll be doing today is hearing the 3 papers being presented in the order they're listed in the program, with Ryan Heckman first, Zachary Weinland second, and Marty McKew third. When all 3 papers have been presented, I'll have just a few minutes of remarks to put each of the papers in context, and then we'll finish up by welcoming chat questions. So those of you in the audience, if a thought occurs to you, a question occurs to you, as one of our speakers is presenting his paper, jot down a couple keywords so you can ask a succinct question. Often many of us, including people like me, get rather prolix, but with chat, if you can ask a succinct question, hone it down to a few key words, I think that will help things move along at a better pace. Well, I've had the privilege of reading these 3 papers beforehand, and I know that they're interesting. I don't want to take a great deal more time before we get started here. We'll start with Ryan Heckman's paper on the life of the medieval German Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Patriarch of the German nation. Ryan and I are well acquainted. He is fascinated by early history, so he's had medieval history from me. His current semester, he's taking Irish history before he graduates in May and goes off to fulfill his military obligation. The paper he's presenting today arose from an interesting course I taught last semester, a capstone course for our history majors called Medieval Biography. I'll save any further comments for when he finishes, so I'll hand things off now to Ryan, who I think is going to screen share his paper with you so you can follow along. Ryan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Professor Suppe. So yes, I'll share my paper so everyone can read along with me if you wish. All right. So the life of Frederick Barbarossa, Patriarch of the German nation. Frederick I, also known as Frederick Barbarossa, was the Duke of Swabia, the King of the Germans and the Romans, and most importantly, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire from his coronation in 1155 to his death in 1190. His famous nickname, Barbarossa, came from the Italian words for Redbeard, his most notable physical feature. Frederick was a descendant of both the Hohenstaufen and Welf families, which were the foremost dynasties in Germany, rivals for German kingship, and subsequently the seat of emperor of the Holy Roman Empire as well. Frederick lived from 1123 to 1190 and ruled from 1152 to 1190. His empire was afflicted with issues he had to deal with from the very beginning of his reign. Lesser lords were gaining more land and resources through feuds, leading to a decentralization of political power. Great princes of the German states had flimsy loyalty to the emperor, and Lombardic cities in Italy attempted to overthrow imperial authority in favor of greater independence, which led to Frederick campaigning in Italy 6 times over the course of his reign. During the first campaign in 1154 to 1155, Frederick was crowned emperor by the Pope. Milan, one of the most powerful Lombardic cities at the time, was a frequently recurring enemy throughout Frederick's reign. In 1162, Frederick completely erased the city of Milan. In 1174, Frederick campaigned in Italy for the 5th time against the Lombard League, which had garnered the support of Pope Alexander III. During this campaign, the imperial army was devastated by a plague, and Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Frederick's own cousin, refused to come to his aid. Frederick was defeated by the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. Although Frederick was forced to desist from asserting imperial authority in Italy and throughout the church, he continued to rebuild the empire in other fashions. Frederick overcame his long-standing Norman enemy in Sicily by marrying his son, Henry VI, to the heiress of Sicily, Constance I, which allowed his empire to occupy the southern parts of Italy. In 1180, Frederick defeated and exiled Henry the Lion, and Frederick's long-standing papal rival, Alexander III, died 1 year later. Frederick also broke the trend of elected kings and emperors by forcing the election of his son to be ruler of the German states. After many years of strife, Frederick finally was finally coming close to restoring the empire to its former glory, but all came to an abrupt end when Frederick drowned in a river while traveling to the Holy Land on the Third Crusade in 1190. Long after his death, Frederick became a legendary figure in German folklore. Tales were made about him not really being dead, but rather sleeping in a cave. And these tales foretell of his return when Germany is in dire need of a heroic ruler. My intention was to understand why Frederick Barbarossa was so revered that his persona was elevated to a mythological level, and perhaps by evaluating the life and history of Frederick Barbarossa through the viewpoint of his contemporaries, I may come to understand how Frederick has become, as it were, the patriarch of a nation, and how his memory still lives in the German heart as an impersonation of German unity. The most apt biography to study for achieving this understanding is The Deeds of Frederick Barbarossa, which was originally written by Otto of Freising, one of Frederick's contemporaries. The chronicle was continued by Otto's secretary, Raleigh, after Otto's death in 1158, and the whole primary source was eventually translated to English by Charles Christopher Miro in collaboration with Richard Emery. Alongside my goal of understanding how Frederick came to be revered as a patriarch of the German nation, I'll be evaluating the work as a whole by its effectiveness of being a biography for Frederick Barbarossa. My working definition of biography is a narrative of a person's life or lives supported by sources in which the author conveys a message either about the person, the world in which they lived, life in general, or gives an understanding of the world today. My personal interest and goal in learning about Frederick I is connected to my evaluation of the deeds as a biography in this way, because the medieval author's accounts are historical sources that reflect the worldview of Frederick and his subjects. The deeds also presents an interesting situation for its evaluation as a biography because it was composed, translated, and edited by multiple authors from different time periods and possibly with different purposes in mind. Miro received his PhD in classical languages from Princeton University in 1908. He was the dean and then president of Colorado College from 1923 to 1934, till he took his position as a professor of biography at Carleton College. His Deeds of Frederick Barbarossa was published in 1953 and received positive reviews from academic reviewers. R.W. Southern explains in his view that Miro's translation is not meant to add significantly to the researches of the German editors Weitz and B. de Simpson, but simply in the main to make the results of their work more widely accessible. Southern believed it to be a pity that Miro did not provide more commentary and explanations for the original work and pointed out a few questionable translations. But he recognized that these points should not obscure the real service which Professor Miro has rendered to historical students by his translations. The Chronicle is divided into 4 books. Otto wrote the first 2 books covering events in chronological order from 1075 to 1152 in the first book, events concerning Frederick's reign from 1152 to roughly 1156 in the second. Rowan completed the 3rd and 4th books at the behest of Emperor Frederick, but these books cover events up to 1160, which means that only 8 years of his 38 years of reign are chronicled in the work. There are significant differences between the writings of the 2 authors. Otto was the Bishop of Freising, as well as uncle to Emperor Frederick, and his writings reveal that he was an erudite author. Rowan, on the other hand, is described by Miro as a lesser figure in every respect in comparison to Otto. Justa Frederici Imperatoris, the original version of the Deeds of Frederick Barbarossa, was physically commissioned by Frederick I, and he personally entrusted the work to Otto's authorship. Miro inserts a letter from Frederick to Otto, in which Frederick requests Otto to write an account of his deeds. Otto was selected not only for his close relation to the emperor, but he was already a renowned historian and philosopher for his work, The Two Cities, which chronicled world history to 1146 under the narrative of a conflict between good and evil. According to Miro, Otto composed the work in bitterness of spirit in the manner of a tragedy due to the decline of the Holy Roman Empire prior to Frederick's reign. However, Otto wrote the Deeds of Frederick with an entirely different spirit, one of hope for peace and prosperity for the empire. Miro compares his new attitude during Frederick's reign to the literature of the Augustan age. In the Deeds, Otto carefully selects details that adhere to the idea that Frederick I was divinely ordained to lead the Holy Roman Empire to peace and prosperity. His language and selection of details demonstrate this attitude. For example, in the beginning of his first book, Otto states, "After the turbulence of the past, not only has an unprecedented brightness of peace dawned again, but the authority of the Roman Empire prevails so greatly by reason of the virtues of our most victorious prince, that the people living under his jurisdiction rest in humble quiet, and whatever barbarian or Greek dwells outside his bounds is overawed by the weight of his authority and trembles. In his preface of Book 2, Otto refers to Frederick as paragon of emperors and kings. Essentially, Otto describes Frederick I as ruler of the world, a continuation of tradition from the Roman Empire of classical antiquity. Bearing this fact in mind, the characterization of Frederick by Otto is very much what one would expect from a ruler of the world. Frederick is often described by Otto as prudent in judgment, noble, valiant, and probably his most prominent characteristic, wrathful in vengeance against rebels and traitors. Frederick is first introduced in the narrative of the chronicle as a man destined to be the nobler heir of a noble father. He at length girded himself for the serious business of a soldier's career. When Otto recounts Frederick's battle against the city of Spoleto, he claims that in that conflict, none fought more energetically than the prince. No one, not even a common knight, was quicker to take up arms. No professional soldier was more ready than he to undergo dangers. It is reasonable to believe that Otto's account is biased, but it still provides modern readers with an excellent perspective than the Holy Roman Empire that may help to gather a better understanding how Frederick came to be so revered. Otto depicts Frederick as just and righteous in both peace and wartime, but Frederick's justice and righteousness in war arrives through his wrath. Otto first justifies the razing of cities by explaining the custom of the Fodrum, an old custom maintained from the time that the Roman Empire passed over to the Franks, in which men of the king's retinue demand an exact payment from Italian cities and towns before the king enters Italy. If they refused to comply or did not make a full payment, the cities and towns were razed to the ground to give evidence of their impudence to posterity. The king was also supposed to be given complete political and judicial control, as well as enough essential supplies to sustain his army. Otto's explanation reveals that, in his mind, Frederick's authority was righteous on account of adherence to ancient custom, that the Roman Empire now rightfully belonged to the Franks and, by extension, the Germans. Once Frederick finally arrived in Rome, ambassadors of the city were sent to him to deliver a speech demanding payment and privileges in exchange for the Roman people to bestow the crown of Roman emperor to Frederick. Frederick, indignant of this proposition, fired back with his own speech, in which he argues that the Franks and Germans wrested the authority and the tools of empire from the hands of the Romans, and that the empire has prospered under them, not with the Roman Republic. He then proceeded to be crowned by Pope Hadrian IV, which infuriated the Romans. They rioted against Frederick and the Pope, killing some of the lower-ranking soldiers, and Frederick retaliated with the might of his army. Otto describes the event to the reader by writing, "You might have seen our men ruthlessly and ferociously killing and wounding and killing, and seeming to say, 'Take now, O Rome, Teutonic iron instead of Arabian gold. This is the price which your prince offers you for your crown. Thus do the Franks purchase empire. These are the gifts given you by your prince. These the oaths sworn to you.'" These lines reveal the attitude of Frederick and his army toward the Italians. The right of authority and empire resides with Frederick and his German subjects, and any attempt from the Italians or any other nation to withhold this right from them will only incur death and destruction. The last major event that Otto recounts is the Diet of Regensburg. He discusses Frederick's judgment of two notable princes for feuding against each other in the Rhineland while Frederick was campaigning in Italy. He spared one and sentenced the other to death. Otto claims that when this stern judgment was promulgated throughout the breadth of the Transalpine Empire, so great terror came upon all that everyone desired rather to keep the peace than to promote the confusion of warfare. According to Otto's account, Frederick established his authority abroad and in his homeland with just and righteous terror. However, the truth is much more complicated than Otto reveals. Miro points out that Otto focuses on the siege of Tortona instead of Milan in order to conceal Frederick's military weakness by distracting the reader from the fact that Frederick's army had to leave Milan relatively unscathed after being exhausted from an unfortunate campaign that incurred disastrous long-term effects for the empire. Otto continuously avoids the controversial subjects of his time, such as the conflict between the imperial state and the church and the conflict between the Hohenstaufens and the Welfs, as he belonged to or was related to all of these different factions in some fashion. These conflicts also did not fit into his theme of destined peace and prosperity under Frederick, as they were unresolved at the time of his writing. Despite his biased selection of details and occasional mistakes, Otto still provides a great amount of important historical information through his coverage of Frederick I's first years of rule. Otto's narrative has a clear purpose of extolling the deeds of Frederick I. His account is historically valuable due to being a reliable primary source, as well as by providing modern readers the perspective within the whole Roman Empire of the High Middle Ages. While Otto avoided the controversial subject of the conflict between the emperor and the papacy, his continuator, Raleigh, had no intention of avoiding any subject, as he wished to present the full truth of the deeds of Frederick in his account. But he does not explicitly take a side in the controversy. In his coverage of certain events, Raleigh copies entire primary sources such as letters or decrees, often from both sides of controversy, in order to appear unbiased in his presentation of history. And he explains in his coverage of the schism in the church between Bishop Octavian and Bishop Roland that he supplies the primary sources to allow the reader to decide for himself who bore arms with greater justice. Raleigh's account is found to be historical importance in this manner because he has preserved other valuable primary sources within the work. In one instance, Raleigh records a letter from Eberhard, Bishop of Bamberg, and a close advisor of Frederick, to Cardinal Henry, in which there is a brief but valuable insight into Frederick's personal character. Eberhard writes, "The Lord Emperor, when your envoy arrived, suddenly left the camp on some private business. Therefore, I could not by my representations elicit a definite reply from him, nor could you have a letter from him immediately. You know the kind of man he is. He loves them that love him and is estranged from others, because he has not yet completely learned to love even his enemies." The message reveals Frederick's strong-willed and obstinate nature that perhaps Eberhard was frustrated with, but had to accept. Raleigh was most likely leaning in favor of the imperial party because of his historical treatment of a council called by Frederick to settle the schism between the pro-imperial candidate, Bishop Octavian, and an anti-imperial candidate, Bishop Roland. Raleigh makes the council seem unbiased, but Miro notes that no church outside the empire was represented. As Raleigh says, some other governments sent observers, but was a council of prelates faithful to Frederick. There could be no doubt that would decide for Octavian. Miro is also sure to point out that the collection of documents from the council that Raleigh inserted into his account are all statements for the case for Octavian. Raleigh's account differs from Otto's in another fashion. Miro explains that Raleigh, who must have realized the inadequacy of his own style and often enough the paucity of his information, had a fondness for borrowed finery. Raleigh frequently uses historical accounts of the ancient Roman Empire's wars, such as Josephus's Jewish War and Sallust the Jugurthan War and Catiline's War, with a person and place name switched out to serve as a substitute for original account of Frederick's deeds. Raleigh not only told of certain events in this manner, but he went as far as attributing speeches that were originally made by Roman emperors such as Titus to Frederick I. Raleigh finishes his account with a characterization of Frederick, including his appearance, presence, and personality. However, most of the descriptions of Frederick the reader receives can be found almost word for word in the writings of Einhard, in which he describes Charlemagne, and the writings of Apollinaris Sidonius, in which he describes Theodoric II of the Visigoths. Raleigh's description may be accurate, but is not his original impressions of the emperor. Miro condemns Raleigh's skill as a historian for his frequent use of this technique, but Mommsen, in his review of Miro's translation, explains that we ought to remember that the German translator of the deeds, Dr. Horst Kohl, pointed out that Raleigh apparently used his sources with a great deal of discretion. Mommsen quotes from Dr. Kohl, "Raleigh was not induced by a stylistic dependency on the ancients to copy them out without any plan and at the expense of truth. Raleigh's dependency on the ancients may also be a way to demonstrate Frederick's similarity to ancient Roman rulers, revealing him to be the heir of the Roman Empire, and thus legitimizing his imperial authority. Raleigh's account continues many of the themes present in Otto, such as justifying Frederick's imperial authority and glorifying his character, presenting Germany as a unified, peaceful land due to Frederick's deeds, depicting the people of Milan as treacherous, dishonorable, and base, and the idea of Frederick's righteous continuation of the Roman Empire. The deeds of Frederick Barbarossa is an excellent biographical and historical account due to the combination of the primary source material and the commentary provided by Miro. Chronicles written by Otto of Freising and Raleigh provide a significant insight into the mindset and worldview of people living under and in accordance with Frederick's rule. Muro's notes reveal a broader picture of the Holy Roman Empire and make corrections to the mistakes of the two medieval authors. The only aspect that hinders the deeds is the fact that this chronicle only covers 8 years of Frederick's reign. By experiencing the short history of Frederick's reign through Otto and Roland's perspective, one can understand how Frederick Barbarossa's strong will, ambition, leadership, and personality brought a renewed faith to the German nobility in their efforts to carry the right and authority of the Roman Empire, which contributed to the mythologization of his character and his transformation into a symbol and patriarch for Germany long after his death. And that's the end of my paper.
You're muted, Dr. Suppe. Fred, you're muted. The little microphone in the bottom left-hand corner, you just want to click on that. In the left-hand corner of your screen at the bottom, if you roll your mouse over the Zoom window, you'll see a microphone or a symbol of a microphone, and you just want to click on to unmute. Right here. I can help you in the chat. We could just move to the next presentation now, which is Zachary Weinland. Zach, would you like to start?
Yeah, sure. Dr. Suppe, you might also be able to press Alt-A, and maybe that will unmute. Okay, I think I will also share my screen just to get my paper on the screen. All right, can everybody see that?
Yep, okay. Looks good.
Great. So my paper is called The Mythos of Father Raleigh and the Battle of Norridgewock, 3 historical perspectives, their differences and their origins. I kind of came across this somewhat specific historical event when I was reading a book called War and Gender in Colonial New England by Anne Little. Essentially, Norridgewock was a French missionary outpost in Maine, and it became of especially strategic importance after Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s because France ceded a lot of their territory in Canada to the British, which means that their territory in Maine and other, northern North American outposts became all that more important, especially Norridgewock, which was on the Kennebec River. And as a Catholic missionary near Protestant colonies, the English Protestant colonies, there was a lot of talk and a lot of fear surrounding him. So that's the context of my paper, and I'm just going to go ahead and start reading it. On August 23rd, 1724, a regiment of English soldiers attacked and then burned the Abenaki settlement of Norridgewock on the Kennebec River in Maine, killing the Jesuit priest Sebastian Raleigh, who had been a missionary there for 30 years. While the true facts of the life and death of Father Raleigh are still disputed, close comparison of the various primary sources, contemporaneous histories, and surviving oral traditions reveal how 3 distinct narratives emerged along cultural lines, that of the English, the French, and the Abenaki Indians. Each perspective makes not only explicit claims about the events surrounding the Battle of Norridgewock, but also implicit claims about the relationship between the 3 peoples of the New England frontier in the early 18th century. New Englanders feared and despised Father Raleigh and his Catholic mission at Norridgewock. According to Samuel Penhallow in his History of the Wars of New England with the Eastern Indians, published only 2 years after Raleigh's death, the Jesuit was a bloody incendiary and instrumental to most of the mischiefs that were done to us. by preaching up the doctrine of meriting salvation by the destruction of heretics. The historian Anne Little suggests that New Englanders believed Father Raleigh possessed diabolical powers, for his success at converting the local natives and retaining them as French allies could not be explained otherwise. In fact, most of the Norridgewock Indians supported peace with the English at any cost, and they only pursued military action as a last resort. One example of this, in 1721, English authorities took 4 Abenaki hostages on the pretense that they had killed some English cattle, and they set the price of their release at 200 beaver skins. The Abenaki did not take responsibility for this crime, but they paid the 200 skins anyway, at which point the English not only refused to release the prisoners, but also stopped selling lead, powder, and provisions to the Abenaki. Raiding and eventually open warfare between the English and the Abenaki resumed, and so the narrative of troublesome Indians under the influence of Catholic missionaries was once again amplified. Under pretenses such as the one just described, the New England colonies made war with the French allied Indians on the frontier. One of the primary goals of what came to be known as Dummer's War was the capture of Father Raleigh. In January of 1722, the English made their first attempt, reaching Norridgewock, but finding it deserted. Father Raleigh had been informed in advance of the English approach. In 1724, they tried again, and the events of that expedition are relayed in the following English accounts. From the English documents, the sworn statement of Colonel Johnson Harmon and the histories published by Samuel Penhallow and Governor Thomas Hutchinson, also published around that time, for the most part corroborate one another and provide a historical basis for the events of August 23rd, 1724. According to their description, according to Captain Harmon, 200 men, including English soldiers and their Mohawk allies, traveled up the Kennebec River. About half split off to search the nearby cornfields, while the other half approached Norridgewock. The men entered the town silently until one Indian emerged from his wigwam and alerted the rest. Vastly outnumbered, the Indian warriors fired 2 volleys at the English, while the rest attempted to escape by the river. The warriors, who were covering for the women and children, then retreated to the river also. The English followed closely, attacking the Indians as they tried to cross the river. About 50 men, women, and children ultimately made it across. During their escape, Father Raleigh remained in the village, firing upon the English from one of his houses. An English soldier soon forced his way into the house, whereupon Father Raleigh refused quarter and continued loading his gun, and so the English shot him in the head. Modern readers may be disturbed not only by the massacre of the fleeing men, women, and children, but also the candid admission of it in the various accounts of the soldiers. But for those English men for whom Father Raleigh and his Indian followers represented an existential threat to the lives of their countrymen, the attack on Norridgewock was a matter of patriotic duty. To New England in general, the Battle of Norridgewock was celebrated as a mighty victory for the English colonists over their enemies. To Penhallow, it was the greatest victory we have obtained in these last 3 or 4 wars. A broadside, which is basically a colonial version of a newspaper comic or an illustration, published in Boston shortly after the attack, describes the noble action of Captain Harmon, the courage of the soldiers, and it condemns the cruel rebel Indians and old Friar Raleigh who fought with cruel hate. And that was the source, by the way, that I originally found the inspiration for this paper for. Such statements would not be out of place in the English print culture of the time. The English press of this period constituted a high point of anti-Catholicism in America. Pamphlets with frightening names like The Cruel Massacre of the Protestants in North America were published all throughout the mid-18th century, and that pamphlet in particular contained many gory descriptions of scalping and little discussion of religion. It is no coincidence that anti-Catholic sentiments reached their peak during the half-century of near constant warfare between New England and New France. Anti-Catholicism in New England both influenced and was augmented by this conflict. As we saw in the events leading up to Dummer's War, New England authorities who were interested in settling the Maine frontier provoked war with the Abenaki. The resulting damage to English crops, livestock, homes, and people must have only reinforced the worldview of many New Englanders that France and its Catholic allies sought the ultimate destruction of Protestant New England. Fear of Catholic domination over America provided a useful framework for those in the English ruling class desperate for access to land and trade in the French frontier. The story of Father Raleigh as an existential threat to Protestant life in New England is the perfect example of this worldview. To the French, Father Raleigh was first and foremost a point of political leverage for colonial leadership. The Marquis de Denonville, Governor General of New France from 1685 to 1689, stated clearly, though the interests of the gospel should not engage us to keep missionaries in all the Iroquois and other Indian villages, the interest of civil government for the good of commerce must see to it that we always have some there, for these native peoples cannot be governed except by missionaries who alone are able to maintain them in our interests and prevent them from revolting against us. This was especially true at Norridgewock. Though technically within English boundaries, Norridgewock assured French control of the upper Kennebec River, which was a necessity after the English won control of Newfoundland, Acadia, and Hudson's Bay in Queen Anne's War, cutting off many important French trade routes. The loss of such a vital outpost certainly embarrassed and outraged French colonial authorities once Norridgewock was finally taken, who now had to decide how to report this incident to the mainland, from whom they received supplies, money, and manpower. In a letter from Father de la Chasse to a fellow Jesuit priest, we hear a very different description of the Battle of Norridgewock. Instead of 200, the English army consists of 1,100 men. The cornfields surrounding Norridgewock are now dense thickets, providing cover for the approaching army. Father Raleigh faces his final moments at the foot of a cross erected in the middle of the village, with 7 of his faithful converts surrounding him in an attempt to protect the life of their dear father. None of these details are consistent with the accounts of the English soldiers who were actually present at the battle. Father de la Chasse's letter appears to be an attempt to portray the loss of Norridgewock as an unavoidable tragedy at the hands of a powerful and cruel English army. The letter also unsurprisingly emphasizes the devotion of the converted Indians to their father and to Catholicism. This is not as notable as the effect of anti-Catholicism on the English perspective, though, because, of course, French authorities would inflate, they were, of course, preferential towards their own religion. What is notable about the historical error that both the English and the French narratives share is the notion that the Norridgewock Indians were these ever-loyal servants of Father Raleigh, for good or for bad. Unfortunately, the survivors of the Norridgewock massacre left no historical documents to challenge this European narrative. However, an Abenaki oral tradition does persist, which purports that a clairvoyant shaman, who in some accounts is a man and in others a woman, among the Abenaki at Norridgewock had a vision of incoming danger. Father Raleigh supposedly dismissed the warning, and only the shaman's family survived by escaping the day before the attack. The rest, who were supposedly congregated in the church at the time of the attack, were killed by the English. If there was such a clairvoyant warning, it is not shocking that Father Raleigh would have dismissed it. Missionaries always had a contentious relationship with Indian shamans who believed themselves to be of the same profession as missionaries and therefore the same status as the white priests. Yet the Abenaki claim Father Raleigh purposefully ignored this warning and gathered the Indians in the church to be slaughtered because he had been paid off by the English. That was the oral tradition of the Abenaki. There's no historical evidence to support the claim that Father Raleigh had been paid by the English or that the Indians had been specifically in the church at the time of the attack, but surely there must be some explanation for why this oral tradition persists. According to the English, the Abenaki had already sold their land to England. At the signing of the Portsmouth Treaty, which was a treaty which reaffirmed the Treaty of Utrecht, which ended Queen Anne's War, in this treaty, the Abenaki signed away their right to their land in Maine, where Norridgewock was. The Abenaki, like other North American native people, did not recognize individual ownership of land, and so they saw the treaty merely as permission for the English to hunt, fish, and travel the land without hindrance. The Abenaki usually relied on their Jesuit allies to ensure that the treaties they signed with the English were fair, but Father Raleigh, who was conspicuously absent from this conference of the treaty, seemed to have failed them. While the notion that Father Raleigh coordinated with or even accommodated the English in their pursuit of the main territory is unsubstantiated, there is evidence that Raleigh betrayed the will of the Indians to further a French political agenda. When war broke out, a majority of the Norridgewock Indians supported peace with the English. However, by threatening excommunication, intruding upon Indian councils, and demanding that all resolutions passed by the tribe receive his consent, Raleigh successfully replaced the pro-peace chief with a pro-war chief and rallied the Indians to war. During the English expedition to Norridgewock in 1722, which failed to capture Father Raleigh, the English colonel found among the priest's private letters a letter from the governor of Canada directing the Indians to use their utmost force to keep the English from settling at the eastward and promising to supply them with powder and ball for that end, at the same time charging the Jesuits to keep the matter private. Thus, the details of the Indian tradition, while not substantiated, are not without meaning. Father Raleigh did betray the Abenaki to the English by simultaneously committing himself and his followers to both war with the English and a permanent location at Norridgewock for its strategic location on the Kennebec River. He put the Indians in grave danger. In regard to the recurring detail of the Indians being in the church at the time of the attack, perhaps the church is a metonym for the Norridgewock mission itself. Rather than encourage the Abenaki to flee to safety after the shaman's revelation, Raleigh kept them at Norridgewock at the expense of their lives. That three distinct narratives about one Catholic mission in Maine have survived until today is a testament to the symbolic importance of Father Raleigh and Norridgewock. The perspectives of the English, French, and Abenaki were shaped by and in turn reinforced the cultural, political, and religious interests of each group of people. And in looking closely at the three narratives, we can see that the destruction of Norridgewock was more than simply a military victory or defeat. For the French, it was a devastating loss of a strategic frontier outpost. For the English, it was a triumph over an evil force which threatened the very foundations of Protestant life. For the Abenaki, it was proof that neither the French nor the English were ever really friends of the Indians. Thank you.
Zach, thank you very much for a very interesting paper. My apologies to everybody. At the end of the previous paper, I had a very hypersensitive cursor, which took me down some rabbit holes I had not expected. So my apologies for the glitch. Anyway, that's our second paper. The third presenter today is Marty McKew from University of Dayton, who is intellectually ambitious, double major in history and in French, and has plans to go to graduate school after he graduates. He's going to either work on a master's degree in London at the London School of Economics or in Paris. Still hasn't made up his mind. And I know his paper also is very interesting, so I won't take any more time with a further introduction. I'll hand it off to Marty to talk to us about, now let's see, the official full title is Construction of a Man, Nationalism, Identity, Vercingetorix, and the Gauls.
Thank you very much, Dr. Suppe. So here, hopefully you can see this PowerPoint presentation. Yes, I'm Marty McKew. I'm from the University of Dayton, and this is part of my honors thesis for my undergraduate degree. Construction of a Man, Nationalism, Identity, Vercingetorix, and the Gauls. So obviously with this subject, the first thing we need to understand is who is Vercingetorix? In the French ancestral history, the Gauls are the ancestors. They were in Roman Gaul, you may know that term. Vercingetorix was the chieftain of these Gauls who united them against the invading forces of Julius Caesar from Rome. He was eventually defeated at Alesia, paraded through Rome as part of Julius Caesar's victory march, and was eventually strangled in Rome. So as historians, the evidence is obviously very important to us. So what do we know of Vercingetorix? We only know of him from two sources. This one coin with his face on it, presumably printed by Romans, and the accounts of Julius Caesar in his journals, the Gallic Wars. So obviously very limited evidence, and really only one source actually telling us about the man himself. So Caesar and the Gallic Wars. Why did it happen in the first place? Caesar was the governor of the Roman provinces of Cisalpine Gaul and Transalpine Gaul. And there had been histories of barbarian invasion, both from the Germans and the Gauls into Rome. So it was a fresh threat and fear in the minds of the Roman people. And he was able to justify military expeditions as a way to call any possible invasion. And he would also bring back loot and slaves, which in Rome is, of course, very a positive. Why was it recorded in such a manner? Why did he write these journals in the first place? For two main reasons. He wanted to send them back to his political allies and rivals in the Senate. Military expeditions cost money, and they were not particularly interested in letting Caesar do more of these, but so long as he sent back reports of victory and that he was sending back these economic materials, they would allow him to continue doing so. And then it was also read aloud to the plebs of Rome, which were his major support base for his campaigns and for his political power in general. When he eventually begins the Roman Empire, they will be a large part of why the army follows him in the first place. And for them, it's not so much the reports of victory, it's the reports of the Roman army being victorious and a very fictionalized view of the Roman army being inflated. So how did this benefit Caesar? So to talk about that first, I want to talk about the events of the Gallic Wars, which have to do with Vercingetorix, in which we'll look at a few sites. So it starts at Bracta, where Vercingetorix first unites the Gallic tribes to his banner. He moves to Avaricum, which is one of the tribe's home cities, which is being attacked by Caesar. He moves there to defend it, fails, and then moves to Dergovia to do the same with another tribe, and actually wins. And this was a major point for his army, that he won against Caesar and the Romans. And it's known in Caesar's histories, he even acknowledges as one of his great defeats, one of his greatest defeats. And then Vercingetorix eventually follows Caesar as he's retreating in the hopes of wiping him out completely, or at least taking out his baggage that he can't return for that season. Caesar actually reverses his attack and sends him into a retreat to the site of Alesia, where he's surrounded and eventually defeated. So Caesar purposefully creates these events in such a way in the Gallic Wars as to artificially inflate Vercingetorix in the tradition of Roman and Greek authors such as Thucydides and Tacitus and Dio. He gives Vercingetorix agency through speeches, but really what he's doing is talking through Vercingetorix, and by including such things as his defeats, it makes his victories all the more special. Romans don't want to. It doesn't matter if you're defeating a weak army. What matters is if you have a worthy rival and you're defeating powerful armies, which could be a threat to Rome. And this is a very famous piece of art which shows Vercingetorix's defeat at Alesia, and it's titled "The Laying of His Arms at the Feet of Julius Caesar." So then moving on, for many years, he's not discussed at all in the French historical category, mainly because the French monarchy had no interest in bringing him back because he was a pagan and they were Catholic. So he did not really lend any power to their rule. But after Napoleon I begins to be engaged with these topics, Napoleon III in the long 19th century takes Vercingetorix by the horns and reintroduces him to the national zeitgeist of France. So Napoleon III was a relative of Bonaparte, was elected president of the Second French Republic, and then eventually took power and became the French emperor of the Second French Empire. So there's a lot of things here to talk about, but most importantly is that he brings Vercingetorix in as a rallying point for his new empire. The Gauls are an excellent example for the French people because they have many parallels. The French were shamed after the defeat of Napoleon. It was kind of this idea of pride where Vercingetorix, even though he was defeated, still fought. Was eventually defeated, he still fought, and the Gauls still had pride in that. So those two ideas, and then the symbolic meaning of Vercingetorix in general, just as resistance against occupation, against hostile Europe, especially Italy at that time. And so, kind of talking about this a little bit more, Napoleon Bonaparte, had established the Académie Celtique, the Celtic Academy, and this is an emblem of its modern version, the National Society of Antiquaries in France. It has survived till this day. He originally used the Celtic Academy as military justification for his own expansions. The Celtic Academy would find material evidence outside of France, which he would then use as, oh, this is part of original Gaul, or these other Celts were bringing them back into the larger French community in a way. And he also had a legacy of pulling upon Caesar himself as an icon of military justification, and kind of Bonaparte more so than Napoleon III, that he was a figure that he was a peer of. Bonaparte saw himself as a peer, and he wrote commentaries on Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars with this in mind. Now, Napoleon III did the same, but he doesn't see himself as a peer to Caesar. He's an admirer of Caesar, and he writes a history of Julius Caesar with this in mind, a history based on his Gallic Wars. So the way in which Napoleon III brings Vercingetorix into like this French like cultural identification area is through monuments and through art. Mostly, obviously, it's a popular area, so many people see it, and images are very compelling. This is the statue of Vercingetorix at Alesia, the site of his defeat, and Napoleon III, along with art and monuments, he started the archaeological digs at the Bracta, Gergovia, and Alesia, some of the other sites I mentioned, finding evidence of Vercingetorix and the Gauls, and kind of identifying those sites as national sites of importance in French memory. So this statue was put in place at Alesia, and an important thing to note is that the only like image we have of Vercingetorix is that coin from earlier, which itself is a Roman representation of Vercingetorix, yet both of them could be inaccurate. And it is more likely that the Alesia statue is more inaccurate because, as you may see here, it looks very much like Napoleon III. And given that he had it created in the first place, there is that kind of route of self-association. He wants Vercingetorix to be compared to him. So, and this is the quoted inscription on the monument. It really sums up his goals in what he wants Vercingetorix to be for the French people. United Gaul, forming a single nation, animated by the same spirit, can defy the universe. So, and yet, pulling upon an ancient ancestor who's defeated, he is defeated himself in the War of 1870 at the Battle of Sedan. And then after the Battle of Sedan, the Prussian army moves on to Paris, and Leon Gambetta, the figure on the far left, organizes a a very quick defense of Paris and the rest of France, organizing the government in the absence of Napoleon III, who was captured at Sedan. He himself has been compared to Vercingetorix in that Paris was like a new Alesia. In ancient Alesia with Caesar, he had constructed Roman fortifications around the entire town in a circle on both ends, both so that they could defend from the people inside and from help coming from outside. In the same way here, the Prussians have surrounded Paris and bombarded. Eventually, they're defeated, but there is that very distinct parallel of a surrounded France by an occupying power. And this victory parade of the Prussians in the bottom right will have its own parallels in years to come with the World Wars, as the Nazis occupy France and have control over Vichy France during World War II, which is another kind of national shame. So this kind of defeat in parallel, these two defeats make the French people identify much more strongly with Alesia themselves and the Gauls, because they have this defeat in their own present minds, and so they're more willing to identify with this defeat in the past. Gambetta himself has had his monuments in Paris. The one on the right is from 1900, and the one on the left is from the more modern day. It was destroyed and taken apart by Vichy France for its materials, in much the same way as many statues of Vercingetorix were, because Pétain was not interested. Pétain kind of lost a symbolic battle with the resistance as to which side could better utilize Vercingetorix's image. And we know that he lost this because he eventually ordered the destruction of statues of Vercingetorix, melting them down for materials. Yet he did not do so for Joan of Arc, statues of her. And yet Gambetta here may be associated with Vercingetorix in his mind because it was melted down, or the copper parts at least. And even in the modern mind, it's fascinating. You could almost tell the entire history of France just from the names of its metro stations. There's hundreds of them, and many of them are important battles or people in French history. Alesia and Gambetta both have a metro station named after them. Very interesting comparison. And to finish off with that art, it kind of emerges during Napoleon III's reign, but it especially becomes significant in the wake of 1870, where the French are identifying with this national shame even more so. He becomes much more popular in art and sculpture, poetry and prose. Hundreds of pieces done on him. The painting from earlier of Vercingetorix laying his arms at the feet of Caesar is from this time period. This statue on the right is from the time period, and it's particularly interesting because Joan of Arc becomes a figure which encourages or leads Vercingetorix in a way to become a national hero. And it's a very interesting idea of the idea of a hero leading and creating another idea of a hero, because she was also martyred, and she was before Vercingetorix, she was the primary symbol of French national martyrdom. And she kind of is identified with Vercingetorix in this way, in this time period. You can see them holding hands on the right. A few other ones have her guiding him forward or stepping in front of him, kind of leading the way for this new French figure, French hero of pride, even in defeat, and resistance to occupation, invasion, etc. And it especially leads to an increase in popular recognition of Vercingetorix as a French icon in this way, because of its associated his new association with popular art. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marty. It's now time for me to offer some comments on all three papers. And they may seem to be on three quite disparate topics, But as I thought about this a bit more, I realized the uniting concept behind all of them is human beings need history, just like we need food for physical nourishment. Inherently, we're aware of our pasts, our sense of our past. And so we need and use history to fill in our understanding of who are we? Where did we come from? What are the answers to some of the questions that are concerning us at the time? I'll offer comments now on each of the three papers very briefly to give a little bit of context. As I mentioned when we began, Ryan Heckman's paper started as an assignment in our capstone medieval biography course. And we consider the concept of biography. Is it a legitimate way of doing history, or is it too focused on particular individuals? The culminating assignment was to look at a biography, and I provided students with a list of several hundred that exist in a library here at Ball State. And the task was to analyze the biography, to have a definition of biography, and then to decide how did the biography concerns stack up. Well, Ryan chose an interesting biography because it's not a modern biography. It certainly had many of those. It's a medieval one. It's a primary source. It's contemporary with the time of its subject, the Emperor Frederick Barbarossa, Frederick Redbeard. And not only that, it has two authors. One is Otto of Freising, who was Emperor Frederick Barbarossa's uncle, but also a prominent churchman, a prominent intellectual. But Otto died, leaving the project incomplete. And so a second author, Rahawing, who the modern English translator described as not as sophisticated intellectually or not as practiced in terms of writing. So there's a lot of subtle nuances involved in analyzing this interesting source. One of the aspects is for modern Germans, the 19th, 20th, and 21st century Germans, Frederick Barbarossa is one of their great heroes, unlike American history, where we have a continuous political narrative of president succeeding president. Germany got off the tracks in the Middle Ages, never became a completely unified country. It's not till 1870 that it becomes unified. So lacking political unity, they wanted heroes, and the tradition developed, the folklore developed, that Frederick Barbarossa wasn't dead. He was living underground. He was lurking somewhere in the Harz Mountains in central Germany. And when Germany really needed to be rescued from a calamity, he would come back. This is a phenomenon, by the way, that has a generic name called Sebastianism. Lots of countries.
Fred,
Yes.
I'm so sorry. Can you come closer to your microphone? You're cutting in and out again.
Okay.
That's better. Thank you.
All right. I'm getting too enthusiastic and I have a tendency to wave my arms, and I need room to wave my arms. So I will stop waving my arms and I will get close to the microphone. The phenomenon, Frederick Barbarossa coming back someday when needed, generically this is called Sebastianism. The Welsh have a tradition like this about Owen Glendower coming back someday. There was a Prince Sebastian in Portugal, after whom the phenomenon is named. And this is an example of a German hero who isn't really dead. He'll come back someday when he's really needed. Well, the second paper by Zach Weinland about the French priest may have struck American modern listeners as golly. These English especially, they sound terribly bloodthirsty, and aren't we glad that we don't behave that way today? I thought a few comments about the broader context, not just about this massacre by English settlers in what is now the state of Maine, of Abenaki in Native American tribes, but a broader context of what's going on between England and France at this time. A century before this event occurred, there was the 30 Years' War from 1618 to 1648, mostly affecting Germany, mostly about religion, terribly devastating to Germany. And French Catholics at this time felt their vision of Christianity was the only proper one, and anybody with a contrary Protestant vision was literally damned to hell. Protestants reciprocated the feeling they felt their Lutheran or other Protestant views of what Christianity should be like were the proper ones. Each side felt justified in slaughtering the others. That war ended in 1648, by which time the American colonies had been initially established. However, Europeans still struggled and fought over the issue of what form of Christianity is the proper religion. Later in the 1600s and early 1700s, till his death in 1715, the glorious King Louis XIV of France supported Catholics, gave financial support to some English monarchs, hoping to persuade them to become Catholics. In England at this time, the 1600s and early 1700s, Catholics had become the bad guys, and the English went through considerable gyrations to have reliable, from their perspective, Protestant monarchs. In the late 1680s, much to their dismay, they discovered they had a Catholic ruler, King James II. And so in 1690, the English are delighted. If you look at an old-fashioned English history book, 1690, they have the Glorious Revolution. They get rid of this terrible Catholic ruler, and they install Protestant rulers. And they go through subsequent gyrations, including once they run out of their native royal line, they resort to some German monarchs, the Georges, George I, II, and III, in order to have reliable Protestant rulers. And during the close proximity to this slaughter, the first one in 1722, and the follow-up, the main focus that Zach told us about in 1724, during this time frame in England, there was still a very realistic fear and concern that the Catholics would invade and impose Catholicism on the English. In 1715, there's a Jacobite uprising. A Catholic member of the Catholic branch of the English royal family tries to stage a revolt. It's unsuccessful, but it happens. And 30 years later, a couple of decades after this incident in Maine that we heard about in Zach's paper, 1745, starting in Scotland, there's a Jacobite revolution, a Jacobite uprising, which comes very close to overthrowing the English government. And of course, if you know your American history, the American colonists wanted to become independent of British control and had support from the French. And this was part of the pattern of French-English animosity, particularly focused on religion. So this one particular event that happened in, let's see, west central Maine, as it currently is, has a much larger context. And that's why the English on their side and the French on their side are so vehement about seeing the other side as hostile enemies. Finally, the third paper by Marty McKew, again, a broad context. The Emperor Napoleon III didn't just have a particular personal penchant or interest. In a broader context, the 19th century is a time when European intellectuals discover the Celts. Just to mention a few prominent dates and accomplishments. Around about the year 1800, early linguistic scholars had discovered most of the languages of Western Europe, and some other ones too, are part of a broad family of languages called the Indo-European family. And within that family, there's a group of 6 Celtic languages spoken in Ireland and Scotland, the Isle of Man, Wales, Cornwall, and Brittany. And then intellectuals became interested in, well, what about the literature or the lore that exists in those languages? In France, in the province of Brittany, in 1839, a noble scholar named de Villemarquet collects a batch of Breton, that is Celtic language in France, the Breton folk tales called Barzaz Brej. So this is 1839. Other intellectuals, one in England, for example, a public intellectual, as we would call him today, the professor of poetry at Oxford University named Matthew Arnold, in 1865-66, gave a very influential series of lectures on Celtic literature. I like irony, so I can hardly resist commenting that he did not speak or read any Celtic languages. He was dependent entirely on translations. Fortunately for him, there were quite a number of translations. A bunch of medieval tales called the Mabinogion had been translated into English. So there's interest in the culture of the Celts. And the Emperor Napoleon III, the ruler of France for so long, supported archaeological digs in north central France, and Europeans generally were discovering the physical remains, the artifacts of these ancient Celtic tribes, the ones that Julius Caesar wrote about when he described his conquest of Gaul, including conquest of Vercingetorix. Just to give you a couple of dates, at a place in what is now Austria in 1846, they started excavating an ancient Celtic salt mine and found preserved tools and even bones of Celtic salt miners. Hallstatt is the name for the first Iron Age Celtic culture from about 800 BC to about 400 BC. The later culture, more sophisticated Celtic culture, is called Latin, and that's first discovered in 1857 with subsequent excavations. And there's another parallel to the French interest by Emperor Napoleon III into the ancient Celtic heritage. And that is a mid-20th century phenomenon, French adult comic book Asterix the Gaul, which is purportedly about an ancient Celtic hero of the era of Vercingetorix. And it's no accident that there's a map when you read these comics, which are phenomenally popular, by the way, and been translated to all kinds of foreign languages, including English. Asterix the Gaul was invented in 1959 when the French, well, had initially lost World War II, but came up on the winning side at the end. But in the 1950s, they were starting to lose their empire. They had lost Vietnam by 1959. So there's some parallels there. So these are three very interesting historical projects. I was fascinated to read them and think about them. I hope that those of you in the audience today have enjoyed this too. I will now shut up, and I see we've got at least 3 chat questions. So I will activate these. And let's see. Okay, we've got a compliment from someone in the audience, Dorian Bowe. Thank you all to 3 presenters. All 3 papers offered insightful arguments and the delivery was impeccable. I would agree with that judgment. We'll give a chance here to see if anybody else has any additional chat questions. And just to kind of prime the pump for questions, I'll try to offer a few questions initially before more chat questions come in. For Zach, who spoke to us about the mythos of Father Raleigh. In your paper, you made clear some of the primary sources for the English perspective and also some of the sources for the French perspective. I wonder if you could comment a little bit on how did this oral Native American Abenaki tradition about Father Raleigh, how was that preserved and how did it come to finally be written down? The Abenaki would seem to be kind of the less powerful participants in this situation. So I wondered, did you notice what written sources finally provide the connection with this oral Abenaki tradition?
Sure. So most of my sources for the Abenaki came from a scholarly article that I am currently trying to find. So just give me one moment so I can provide more detail on that. Here we are. Okay. So this was an article in the New England Quarterly. It was published in 1934 by, let's see, by Fanny Hardy Ekstrom. And basically, the author talks about their interest in the myth of Father Raleigh and of Norridgewock, and it talks about how the author visited Maine and spoke originally. This was actually their inspiration for writing this article, was when they were in Maine, they were talking to some ancestors of the Abenaki from that area and got their account of the massacre. Well, not their account because they weren't there. This was 1934, but the oral tradition that had passed down. And until this article came out, as far as I'm aware, there wasn't a known oral tradition of the Abenaki. So obviously that presents some historical problems. We don't know, between 1724 and 1934, when this came out, we don't know what other kind of information could have, affected this tradition. It's obviously, even without outside information, it could have just changed on its own in those 200 years. But and I mean, as we saw, the oral tradition is much different from the historical accounts given by the English soldiers who were present at the battle. So it's not surprising that it's different, but it is interesting that until 1934, we really didn't have any, and I mean, we didn't have any knowledge of an oral tradition, but also we weren't really looking for one. There wasn't really much interest in this event or in this type of history, and so this article was a very useful resource for me, not only for the oral tradition, but it also introduced me to a lot of the sources that I used for my final paper.
Interesting answer. I am not an American historian myself, although I am fascinated by all history, including American history. So I know that during this same period when finally this oral tradition came into written form during the Great Depression, the American government sponsored each state having the gathering and publishing of local history. And so lots of oral traditions from African Americans and other people who weren't politically dominant elite classes finally make their way into writing at this time. And as a Celticist who teaches Irish history and Welsh history, I can tell you, you can have storytellers. And in the book Roots, about the oral traditions of African Americans by Alex Haley. You can use oral traditions, and they have their own procedures and ways you need to treat them critically. but they can be very useful and interesting historical sources. I'm seeing, let's see, one of our chat commentators, Dorian Bowe, put a question in Q&A. Emily, do you know how to bring that up on our screen so that we can see this and I can ask that question?
If you just click on the Q&A at the bottom, it should bring up a window. And if that's not working, I can go ahead and read it.
Okay, I've got it here.
Okay.
Dorian Barbarossa from University of Dayton has a question for Ryan Heckman, writes, thank you for your interesting paper. I grew up in Germany, and I can tell you that Barbarossa was not extensively treated in my primary education. Do you think that's a mistake? What might be the lesson of your topic to school children, whether those growing up in Germany or in the United States?
Yeah, I saw this question earlier, and so I've been thinking a lot about it. And I really agree with your idea that he's not extensively treated in any education, really. Kind of why I chose to look into his biographies was because I really didn't know a lot about him, and I thought it would be interesting to learn more. You know, like a lot of in America, especially, I know Dr. Suppe and I talked about this, that most of medieval history that gets covered is French and English history. And I kind of wanted to switch it up a little bit to learn more about the Holy Roman Empire. I mean, like much of America's ancestry in the 1800s came over from Germany, and I myself have like half of my ancestry is from Germany too, so I wanted to know about that part of this era. But I think the reason why it's not taught extensively is that the Holy Roman Empire really just faded off. And as one professor here at Ball State, I've heard him say, he's kind of a historical loser of in history, because the empire really didn't make a long-term impact on the kind of world that we live on now. He did make a big impact because he was kind of reviewed in the 19th century when Germany was becoming a unified nation. He was kind of viewed retrospectively, and so that's kind of when he got big and got back, and his folklore kind of started to come back into the popular sphere. And I feel like now, after especially in the age that we're in, I mean, some of the like readings from this biography might be a little unsavory to modern people. I mean, they're talking about kind of glorifying and expanding their empire and destroying the Italian city-states. And so I feel like modern people are kind of getting away from that. But I think it'd be okay for people to learn about the folklore of him, because I think that's really interesting. But I don't think it needs to be taught. It's more of a personal or just like basic interest thing for people to learn about folklore and keep that alive. And I think if it was to be an important lesson to be taught, I feel like that should be extended as from a kind of folklore perspective.
Ryan, I'll follow up with kind of a personal question. Now that you've finished this project and assessed this source, do you like Frederick Barbarossa? When you started out, did you have a certain impression or stereotype? And now that you've looked at this primary source and thought about him for many months now, do you still like him, or has your view of Frederick Barbarossa changed at all?
I would say I like him as a interesting, he's definitely an interesting character. Some like, there's other stories about him that I didn't really get into, but kind of as a character and as he was presented in this, I did enjoy reading about him and kind of his, he seemed like a very difficult person to get along with, but he was kind of interesting in that way. So he was kind of interesting to learn about from perspective of like a story character.
Okay, reading more chat here. Dorian Bowe, thanks, Zach, for your great answer. Marty, I have a question, like a comment for you. First of all, Vercingetorix, the information we have about Vercingetorix almost uniformly comes from Julius Caesar, who modestly wrote about himself. Caesar wrote about himself in the third person, although he's writing about his own accomplishments. He says, Caesar does this, and Caesar asked his men to do this. It's a wonderful piece of public relations. The name Vercingetorix is interesting. It may be his name, or it may be more his descriptor or his title position. The Rex part is cognate with Latin rex, which means king. And the beginning there is the word for man. Vercingetorix may mean something like king over men or king over warriors, rather than being his personal name like Ryan or Frederick. The coin, which you showed us, is interesting. There's a whole book analyzing Celtic coins. The Lydians, in what is now Western Turkey, were the first ones to come up with the concept of money, that is, uniform pieces of precious metal. The Greeks recognized a good thing when they saw it, quickly took up coinage, and the Greeks hired many Celtic tribal warriors as mercenaries. And so the idea of coinage passed to the Celts. And so Celtic tribes, including those in what is now France, Gaul back then, enthusiastically started minting their own coins. So don't be sure that that's a Roman coin. A numismatist, an expert on coin, may tell you specifically about that particular coin, but it is distinctly possible, even though Vercingetorix didn't rule or have political influence for very long, there still might have been time for a coin to have been created with his head on it and his name on it. When we say France today, we think, okay, a modern unified country with a very centralized political government. The ancient Celtic tribes, well, were sort of like Native American tribes in North America before white European types got here. Each tribe was separate politically, ruled by a separate king. They shared a common culture, a common language, and a common heroic ethos. You didn't say much about that, which is fair because you were focused on 19th century French enthusiasm for harnessing this bit of, let's call it geographically French history, even though France, the concept, wasn't invented until this Germanic tribe, the Franks, came in after the Roman Empire created the Kingdom of the Franks, which turns into modern France. But you had a very interesting analysis of how the French, feeling increasingly nervous about an increasingly powerful Prussia and Germany that finally became unified, how the French react to this threat to the grandeur and the glorious tradition of French history, Napoleon the first conquering and dominating nearly all of France before his final overthrow. So an interesting example of history being harnessed and manipulated for a particular agenda. Could you tell us a little bit more about what got you interested in Vercingetorix and connecting him up with something more than a millennium later, namely 19th century French nationalism?
Well, let me see. Well, I actually became interested in the idea of historical memory more generally in one of the classes at Dayton, which is titled Ancient History and Modern Ideology. And it specifically talks of ideas like this where there are figures or ideas or concepts from ancient times and how modern states use them, co-opt them for their own political purposes. I found that very interesting. I kind of got interested in these ideas of historical memory, globalism, etc. And since my double major is history and French, for my honors thesis topic, since I was interested in that idea, there was this, I had read the Asterix comics when I was young, so I vaguely knew about that. And I do discuss Asterix in the third section of my thesis quite extensively. But it was kind of just a perfect blend of these different ideas that all came together. Yeah.
And let's see, I'm not seeing any more chat questions at the moment. A question for Zach about the mythos of Father Raleigh. Do you think the poor Abenaki are the victims of both French ambition and English ambition? And initially, when I read the first part of your paper, Father Raleigh seemed to be kind of a positive, heroic figure. But considering how both the French government and the English government treated the Abenaki, to whom he was a missionary, do you think he's equal, if we're going to blame the English colonists for being nasty and violent against the Abenaki, do you think Father Raleigh deserves similar negative commentary?
That's a good question. You definitely make an interesting point that I depicted Father Raleigh, quite heroically at first, and then, went into more of the truth. But in reality, I didn't really go into a lot of the truth of Father Raleigh. I really focused on the myths around him. And so I guess if you're really getting down to what, the actions he took and his relationship with the natives that he was the missionary over, you'll find that while, obviously he writes about how he cares for the Indians and he, has nothing but the best intentions for them and their souls, the truth is that a lot of the Native Americans, when they were being pestered by the English, like I described in my paper, they really just, a lot of them wanted to make peace with the English at any cost. And when that couldn't happen, the English were clearly determined to get Norridgewock and get that location on the Kennebec. They just wanted to leave. They wanted to go further up into Quebec, away from any trouble between the French and the English. And of course, Father Raleigh, because his entire point of being there is because he was sent by the French government. He's a Catholic missionary, so his stated purpose is to be a religious figure, but he answers to French political authorities, and the French political authorities want him to stay there, keep the Indians there, provide them with ammunition and guns, and defend that place from the English. And it would clearly, it's totally understandable why they would do that, because it clearly was the most successful method. None of the Abenaki wanted to stay there, and yet they still fought the English when the English came. They might not have stood a good chance, but they did, fight the English to the best of their ability. And so Father Raleigh, to me, he represents, for the most part, kind of just a French political tool that, he seemed to care for the Indians, for the Abenaki, in a way that he thought he was doing good. But I don't think, because he was, he had to answer to the French political authorities, he just didn't have the kind of modern, he didn't have a conception really of his place in the Abenaki's destruction and in the ultimate, genocide of the Native Americans that we can, look back on with historical hindsight and say, this is a clear example of the broader context of, the conflict between the French and English and the genocide of the Native Americans, et cetera. I think he didn't even consider the idea that maybe listening to the Abenaki and moving them away and getting them to safety, would be better than to hold the ground. And even if they die, at least their souls will go to heaven, and they will stand their ground against the dastardly English. I think that was more of his thought process than any, concern for the Native Americans that would have actually made a significant difference.
Thank you. I'm looking at our dictator, the clock, and we've got one more minute. A while ago, I commented, I'm fascinated by all of history. This has been an intellectual treat for me personally. I enjoyed each of your papers. I enjoyed your presentations and hearing you ruminate further on the topics. So thank you for participating in the conference today and in this session. I know we've got further sessions coming up. So imagine a nice sized group of people. I think there's at least a dozen or so participating. A nice round of applause for you, metaphorically, electronically here as we finish up. We'll leave this session now to free up the electronic capacity for the next coming session. So once again, thank you, Ryan. Thank you, Martin. Thank you, Zach.
Thank you, everybody. And just before we log off here, I'll give you a preview of what's coming up in our next time slot. We have a panel on Reformation era religion, which will be looking at gender, witchcraft, and family in the Reformation era, as well as a panel on navigating the particular challenges of women's history in the public sphere. How do we do public history focused on women and gender? So I hope that you all will be able to join us for one of those two panels. Thank you again to our moderator, Frederick Suppe, and to all of our panelists. Have a great rest of your afternoon.